So this week we are picking up right where we left off in our series called Being Right. We're in part 3 of this series, and if you haven't been with us for the past 2 weeks, it might be helpful for you to go back and listen to part 1 and definitely part 2 of the series, because we're building on each week. We're kind of building on what we talked about the week before. But in case you don't have time to do that, or if you just don't want to do that, I will briefly just kind of bring you up to where we are right now. There's a lot that we covered. But the gist of it, what you need to get through today and not be in the dark, is we said that within us, within just about everybody, there's this internal desire to be right. And not just right about issues, but we want to know that we measure up. And that we cut the mustard, that we meet the standard. And typically where we get into trouble is that as people in the culture and also in the church, we tend to prioritize being right about issues over being right with people. Or we see them as two things that can't work together. Like if we're not right about an issue with somebody, we can't be right with them as people. And that is not true. We looked at a passage where Jesus talked about the importance of being right with people. And that doesn't mean that we just throw the issues out the window, but we can be right with people that we believe are wrong about issues. And if they believe we're wrong about issues, we could still be right with them. We talked about how important that is to him. And if we're going to be the kind of people that follow Jesus, if you consider yourself one of those people, this should be a priority for us. And even if you're not, it is by far the best way to live, to know that even if I don't agree with somebody about something, the two of us can still live in harmony. We can still be right. It's really good to not have to ruin relationships over issues and to not have to be afraid to talk about issues just because we think we might not agree. So that was week 1. Week 2, we talked about the number one thing that stops us from being right with people. We called it shame. Shame. Now, it's a really heavy thing. It's a thing we don't often talk about. But if we all desire to know that we measure up, right, to be right, to know that we are right and therefore worthy of love and acceptance, shame is the feeling that we do not measure up and therefore we're not worthy of being loved, of belonging, of knowing that we're accepted by people and by God. And that's intensely painful. Though we don't often think of it that way, it's something that we avoid like crazy. And so often we are not willing to address where we're wrong. We get defensive, or we try to hide where we might be wrong, or we don't even think about it. Why? Because we don't want to feel the feeling of shame that we don't measure up and therefore we're not worthy to be loved and accepted. But what we said is that if you believe that Jesus is who he says he is, and that he really did what historians said he has done, then what that means, we called it justification. What that means is that in his sight, we are right. We measure up in his sight. Or we might say we are loved and acceptance. We are loved and accepted even when we don't measure up, which is pretty much always, because nobody lives up to this perfect standard, right? So even though we don't measure up, we are loved and accepted by God on the deepest level, and nothing can change that, right? And so what that does is it totally disarms shame. It doesn't mean shame totally goes away, but it gives us a way to deal with it, because when we fear shame, right, we can know, no, we are loved and accepted on the deepest level, unconditionally by God because of what Jesus has done for us. And so we don't have to run from shame, which means we don't have to be afraid of being wrong. And if we're willing to be wrong, then we'll be able to be right with people. But if we're not willing to be wrong, we'll never be right with people. Okay, so that's where we've been. Now, this week, I'll tell you a little something about me. My office is very hot. I'm going to continue to sweat over the next couple minutes. So I'm a fixer, right? And I've heard that this tends to be a problem with men, often in a marriage. A lot of times the husband has trouble feeling because he's always trying to fix, right? And I'm sure this is true of some women as well. I've just heard it tends to be typical of men. So sometimes Allie and I will be talking and she'll be telling me about a problem. And the whole time I'm just thinking okay, how do I fix this? And so she actually has to tell me, okay, I'm going to tell you something. But before I tell you, I want you to know I don't want you to fix it. I just want you to listen. I'll be like, okay. So I stop fixing. Well, this week we're talking about a way to fix when we're wrong with people. We're talking about being right and how to make things right when they're not right. And I think this tool that we're going to give you, right? Last week, the tool was justification, as we called it, like being made right with God. This week, the tool we're giving you, I think it's the first outward step toward being right with people. It's the fast track. It's the fast track to being right with people. It's the thing that most often takes the longest to get to. But if you can get there quickly, it will make things so much easier when it comes to being right with people. And I have found it personally to be extremely freeing. It is so liberating when we practice this aspect of being right with people. But the problem is that it doesn't come natural to anybody, and we often avoid it. So rarely do we see it. So what are we talking about? Here's the big reveal, okay? We are talking about something called confession. Confession. Now, think about confession for a second. Now, think about everything you just thought about. Okay, put that in a little mental box and just put it away. All right? Try to clear your mind of what you think when you think of the idea of confession. If you look at what the word confession actually means and the way it was used in the New Testament, to confess something is simply to state a fact. So you can actually confess something that's positive. In fact, if you've been in the church for a while, you've probably heard of a confession of faith. You're saying what you believe to be true. You're not saying, here's how many different ways I'm wrong. You're saying, here's what I actually believe to be right. Here's what I believe is true. And so when we talk about confessing our sins, to sin, we've talked about this before, to sin is to fall short of the way we were designed to live, right? It's a shortcoming. It's short of the ideal. And so what we can say is to confess your sins is to state your shortcomings, period. Now, if you know anything about stating your shortcomings, or if you've ever thought about stating your shortcomings, or if you've ever stated your shortcomings, you know it's not an enjoyable experience. Nobody really likes to walk around thinking about what a failure they are and telling the world about it. It's not something that typically comes natural. What is natural is to conceal our shortcomings, to cover them up, to pretend they're not there, to try and compensate for them, to convince the world, no, there are no shortcomings here, right? I'm the full, total package. What's natural is to conceal it because we typically don't like to confess it, and that goes back to shame, but that was part 2. And here's what I want you to remember. We're going to look at the words of a man who was around years and years and years ago. His name is Solomon. He was a king. He's known as one of the wisest people who's ever lived. He was actually the son of David. If you know the story of David and Goliath, they killed the giant and then became the king. This is David's son. And here's what Solomon says about confession and concealing. He says, this is Proverbs 28:13. He says, whoever conceals their sins, their shortcomings, does not prosper, doesn't work. But the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. Meaning, think about it this way, no matter whether you're a church person or not a church person, if that's true, then it is helpful for us to state our shortcomings. So tuck that away for a second. Now let's think about it like this. When we think about confession, there's really 2 types of confessions. There's the vertical confession, vertical way to state your shortcomings, meaning we get before God and we tell him everything that we've done wrong. There's a passage that was, there's a little verse, little lines become very popular in the church world. It's written by John, who was a follower of Jesus. He says, if we confess our sins, if we state our shortcomings, God is faithful and just, meaning he has promised that he will forgive our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Now, typically, the idea of cleansing from all unrighteousness, that's kind of a thick, meaty theological concept. So we're just okay, basically what he's saying is if we state our shortcomings, then God will forgive us, right? We confess, we're cool with God. But the idea of cleansing from all unrighteousness, right? If righteousness is the standard we all instinctively desire to live by, right? That idea of measuring up, then unrighteousness is the idea of not measuring up. What John is saying here is that confessing your sins, even to God, cleanses us from the things that we don't want. It's helpful. We prosper because it leads to change. It's a helpful thing. Think about it like this. I played football in high school. I tried to, at least. And when I first started, I had a really, really tough time tackling people. There was just really not a lot going for me. And I remember one time specifically, we had this running back on our team. The guy was unbelievable. He broke all these school records. Best player on our team by far. And I was on defense. And I remember one time he ran to the outside and he ran right toward me. And I'm like, okay, here we go. It's time for me to tackle this guy. Now, this guy's like a machine, all right? His arms were like these, they were bigger than my legs, all right? Just huge. And I'm looking at him, and I'm like super determined. I'm ready to take this guy down. And I run up to him, and I just come flying at him to hit me. And he stops running. He waits till I get to him. And as I dive at his body, he reaches out one hand and just throws my face straight to the ground. And then he continued to literally, we were in practice, but he walked down to the end zone, right? It was a really humbling experience for me. But it was frustrating. I was like, what the heck? What is my problem? Why can I not take these people down? So at some point, I watched film and I saw what I was doing. What I noticed was that, one, I was standing straight up, which is not good if you know anything about physics. And two, I kept leaving my feet. I would like lunge. And so I would lose any kind of like grounding that I had. And it was just together, it was a lethal combination. It made me totally not lethal on the football field. And so once I saw that, I was able to make steps toward change. What if we understood confession, of course, as a part of our relationship to God, right? If you have a relationship with God. Of course, as part of a relationship where we acknowledge, okay, here's where I've fallen short, here's where I've messed up, but also as a time of self-evaluation, where we can look at the way that we've been living and recognize, is this the standard that I want to live by? At some point, I'm going to look back at the end of my life, right? For a lot of people, really that happens only at the end of their lives. But what if we were the kind of people that were constantly living and looking back, and what we call evaluation? Anyone in the business world will tell you that evaluation is really the only way to make progress. And so why don't we apply that to our lives? What if we understood confession as a way to acknowledge our shortcomings so that we could work toward change that in the end is going to allow us to prosper. It's going to cleanse us from the things that we don't want, right? Whoever acknowledges or confesses will find mercy. It's the one who conceals that will not prosper. I can keep playing football and just pretend, no, I'm fine, and I'll just keep getting smacked to the ground. Or I can stop, look back, and fix the problem. When I was in school, I learned about this thing. It was called the prayer of examen. And it's something that a lot of people do at the end of the day. They get into bed, and some people get on their knees. Some people do it on their back with their head on their pillow. Those people often don't make it to the end of the prayer. But either way, the idea is that you take some time at the very, very end of the day and you look at what your day was like while you were praying. You kind of talk to God about how your day went. And I have not made that a regular thing, but the times that I've done it have been so, so helpful, because it's been a time where I can see like, wow, that one thing that I did, that was a really helpful thing. That was life-giving to me. That was energizing. I'm really glad that I spent some time doing that. Maybe I'll continue to do that. But it also helped me see like, you know what? I was really impatient during this time of the day. Maybe if I wasn't so rushed before that, I wouldn't have unloaded on that. And it's a way to look back, to confess where you've fallen short, and to work toward changing that. It's a really, really helpful thing. So that's the idea of vertical confession. To stop and look at where you are, at what you've been doing. And maybe today, here's like a little idea, maybe for you, the best thing you could do this week is to practice the prayer of examen. Or if praying is not your thing, right, if you're not there yet, maybe you just sit and mentally go through your day and think about what your day has looked like, what your morning looked like, what your afternoon looked like, and your evening, and what you want to do more of, what you want to do less of. Self-evaluation, right? Acknowledge your shortcomings. However, there is also another kind of confession that is equally as important. We would call it horizontal confession. Now, if you remember our passage from week 1, it was the story about like that Jesus kind of painted this hypothetical situation. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but basically he said, if you go to make a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, right? You're a Jewish person. That's what they did back then. That might have taken you several days. You might have been walking for 3 days to get there. And he said, if you get there and you remember that something is not right with you and somebody else, go fix it. Go make it right. And then come offer your sacrifice. He's talking about people who are going to do a vertical thing. In fact, often when people were offering sacrifice, it was a form of confession. It was a form of acknowledging their shortcomings and trying to make up for them. That's what they were doing back then. So it was a vertical thing. But he says, hold on a second. The vertical should at least remind you of the horizontal. Think about it. If you're going to God and saying, God, I was angry at my friend and I shouldn't have been. Who's involved in that? You and God? Sure, and he'll forgive you. But there's someone else, right? If we take that passage that Jesus talks about, right, with the whole idea of sacrifice, and we applied it to all of those situations, the vertical confession should always lead us to a horizontal confession. In fact, you can even make the argument that what Jesus is saying is that you should have horizontal confession before you have vertical confession. So I'll tell you a little story. Maybe this will kind of help put this in perspective. A few years ago, I'm not going to say any names, but my daughter was playing with this little boy. And this little boy was being rude and obnoxious, right? He would like push her, he'd tell her to get out of the way. And I'm just sitting there and I'm watching and I'm like, okay, do I want to be the guy that's going to like yell at someone else's kids? Not yell, but correct. And so I'm just like keeping my mouth shut. He's just like, he just keeps like pushing her and he's like laughing at her and I'm watching her. She's like hurting, literally. She's like emotionally hurting from what he's saying. And then he comes up to me and he's like, hey, let's play. And he's coming to me and trying to establish a relationship with me. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, oh, you don't want to play with me right now because of what you've been doing to my little girl, right? Well, what if we understood God as a father and people as his children? Going to him vertically with vertical confession while continuing to mistreat the people that he loves, his children, would be like that boy coming to me and trying to establish a relationship with me, trying to get something from me while he's mistreating my daughter. But hold on. You want to be friends? Before you come to me, go fix or stop doing that to her and go fix what you've been doing with her. And then come back to me and then we'll have something to talk about, right? Vertical confessions should always lead to horizontal confession. And here's the deal. Again, you take the words of Solomon. It works. The one who conceals their shortcomings is not going to prosper. It is instant progress in the whole, if you look at the whole realm of being right with someone, if you will, right off the bat, acknowledge your slice of the pie, even if it's only 10%, like we talked about last week, it is 10% out of the way right away if we start with horizontal confession, if we start by acknowledging our own shortcomings. And not just that, but it instantly diffuses the situation when we're willing to admit we are wrong, even if it's just a little bit, and even if it's a lot. So if you remember, if you've been like tracking with us for the past few weeks, you might remember me telling a story one week about my daughter and how I was teaching her to ride a bike, and in the road, somebody like came around and they made a sharp left, and I was in the street, so they saw me. But if I wasn't in the street, that could have been a really bad situation because my daughter was riding her bike there. So anyway, I let the person go. Well, not too much long later after that, okay, so it's kind of hard to describe, but my house is not the house on the corner. It's right next to the corner. And when I leave in the morning, I back my car in, I park like tail in, so I could pull out, make a quick right, and then another quick left, and I get on the road and I'm on my way, right? So sometimes, because I have to make a quick right and then a quick left, sometimes that like what should be an S or a Z starts to like not be such a clear and pronounced S or Z, especially if it's early and there's nobody in the road. Here's my defensive justification, right? And so sure enough, one day, I'm pulling out pretty early in the morning, and in the same area where I was upset with people for not driving the right way, I pull out and I go to make that left, and there's a stop sign, and I didn't give it the attention that it deserved. And sure enough, this car comes out, and I almost hit the car, and we both slam on the brakes. And the woman who was driving, it wasn't the same woman, though that would have made for a better story. It wasn't the same woman. She stops her car. We both stop. She looks at me, and then she drives slowly, and the window rolls down. I'm thinking like, oh no. So I rolled down my window because we were about to engage in a conversation. And she looks at me, and she goes, "There's a stop sign there in case you didn't see it." Now, I don't know if she knew my house was right there, because I definitely did know the stop sign was there. I definitely did see it. I'm glad she didn't know that was my house. But I looked at her, and I said, "You are absolutely right. I am so sorry." And she stopped and just kind of exhaled and just shook her head and drove away. And it was one of those moments. That's not always how I react in life in general. Less frequently do I respond that way. But in that situation, I did. And all of a sudden, like, it helped me realize, wow, like, it was eye-opening. You know what? I was upset not too long ago for someone who was making a boneheaded move right here. And now here I am doing it. And it also helped her to just all of a sudden just relax. Like, okay, he messed up and he knows it. And she drove away. And that was the end of it. She didn't give me a pat on the back or anything. I didn't deserve a pat on the back. But it totally diffused everything. Now, if there was some kind of fault on her part, in that situation there was zero, but if there were, I'm willing to bet she would have been much more likely to talk about it because I had acknowledged where I was wrong. It is extremely helpful to not conceal our shortcomings. When we acknowledge them, like Solomon says, we find mercy. I acknowledged it and renounced it. And she was like, okay, whatever, I'll let you go. And she continued on, and that was the end of that. I was reading a book not too long ago, actually last week, and there was this chapter in a book. It was about being called out. And basically what the author was saying was we need to care more about the hurt that we've caused than the hurt that we feel when someone acknowledges the hurt that we've caused. What if we were the kind of people that we're not afraid of that? We're not afraid of somebody saying, hey, you're wrong there. Nice try, but you're wrong. What if we were quick to confess and say, oh, you know what? Like, you're right. That was out of line. I shouldn't have done it. Think about how that would change our relationships. Think about how that would change the way that we disagreed with people. Think about how that would change our conflicts, our marriages, our relationship with our kids, our relationships with our parents, if we were willing to be called out. I think it would be helpful. But that starts with dealing with shame. And this is where we come back to last week. We have to know that we are loved and accepted, that we don't have to worry about the fact that we are imperfect, that we're accepted anyway by God. And if you don't believe this, like I said last week, it's kind of the end of the road. I could just kind of say, well, you have to deal with your shame in order to acknowledge, be willing to acknowledge your guilt. But if you do believe this, this is the key. This is what will give us the ability to own when we're wrong. And it's not an easy thing to do, but knowing that we are loved unconditionally, knowing that even though we don't measure up, we don't have to fear being unworthy. We don't have to fear not being loved. That's what allows us to address our wrongs. Not too long ago, I was watching a little documentary. It was released by Apple on Apple TV. It's called Dads. And Allie and I were looking for something to watch. It was a little bit after Father's Day. And I was like, hey, let's watch this documentary. It's called Dads. You know, maybe it's right around Father's Day. Maybe they're going to talk about how great dads are. You know, it's going to make me look pretty good. And it'll be great, you know? I mean, I didn't articulate any of those feelings, but that's probably what's going on deep down, right? Maybe not that deep down, but like, let's watch this. And I was like, yeah, sure, great, fine. You're better than sports, though there are no sports on. So I turned it on, and it totally backfired. The documentary was all about these dads that were just unbelievable, amazing. This one guy who was a stay-at-home dad, and he struggled with it at first, but he pushed through it. And then he started filming all his interactions. Now he's famous, and he's got this show about what it's like to be a dad. And he does everything right, and he loves it, and his kids love him. He has this amazing relationship. And then the wives come on, they talk about the dads and how amazing they are, and how often they help out, and how they carry the load of parenthood. And as I'm watching this, it was just like this 1 hour and 20-minute wave of shame. Like, that is not me. I try, but that I do not live up to the standard that these guys are setting. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about what our series is right now, and I'm thinking about the fact that what I want to do, 1, is turn it off. 2, I want to get up and just go to the kitchen and get some food. Or 3, I want to pause it and tell Allie why all these guys are wrong and why I shouldn't be held to that standard because that's unrealistic. And I just feel it. I feel the defensiveness. I feel all of it. Why? Because it's a reminder that I don't measure up. I don't measure up. And there is that whole, we actually haven't finished it yet, but that whole thing, because I don't want to watch it, that whole thing could be an awesome opportunity for me to see how I can improve as a dad, how I could be more present for my kids, how I could put my phone away, how I could help my wife carry more of the parenting burden than I do right now. But if I haven't dealt with the shame within me, it's just going to turn into an argument. Or at best, it'll just be something we avoid talking about. I'll conceal my shortcomings. So if we're going to be people who confess and don't conceal, because that's what's best for us and our relationship, that's what we need to do to be right with people, we need to make sure we deal with shame. Like I said last week, that starts first with knowing that we've been made right with God. So here's my challenge for you this week. What if, maybe you do this for 7 days, okay, until the next time you come back to this series. What if, for 7 days, every confrontation began with a confession before you touched someone else's slice of the pie? You took the time to think, where are my shortcomings here? How can I own them before we touch their slice of the pie? Even if it's a confrontation because someone has blatantly done something wrong to you, what if you started by just acknowledging your shortcoming, meaning acknowledging that at the very least, you don't have all the information. Maybe there's something that you perceive that isn't totally accurate because you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, because you don't know you don't know. What if we started by acknowledging our own shortcomings and limitations before every confrontation? Before I attacked my wife for not doing A, B, or C, what if I acknowledged where I haven't been around to help? Before I got on my kids and told them they should have done this, that, or the other thing, what if I just took a minute to think, hey, maybe part of this is on my end. Maybe I haven't been doing something that I'm doing. What if before we got mad at our parents, what if we took a minute to think, okay, how have I made life for them lately? What if we started first with where we are? What if we actually lived, even if it's just for 7 days, like being right with people starts first with us. Thanks for being with us this week. I hope to connect with you again next week for part 4 of Being Right. Take care.